Welcome, everyone. This is part one of the Intro to Sociocracy course being hosted through the Design School for Regenerating Earth. And I'm Andrew Voltavine. I'm very excited to be here with you all today. It's good to see faces I know, faces I don't know. This is lovely. I use they, them pronouns. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I am currently training with Sociocracy for All as a consultant, and I am certified as a sociocracy facilitator. So I have some training and getting more training every day. I actually have a class after this. So I'm learning just as you are learning, and I'm excited to share what I have been learning with you all. I also want to acknowledge that talking about governance can be a very sensitive topic. It can bring up a lot of emotions. It can bring up a lot of friction in your body. So really paying attention to how you're feeling and where the emotions are coming up, they are welcome. And also having some sensitivity that there are moments where people might share stories about what's actually happening in their organizations. And so just respecting people's confidentiality and holding those as fairly anonymous. You're welcome to share the stories elsewhere as long as you anonymize the content. So just a note, maybe that won't come up, but in case it does, I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page about that. Do we have any logistical questions before we go ahead and get started? Okay. All right. So I will start my slides here. And actually, before I do that, I just want to get an idea of what inspired you to come to this course today. What was the fire that was like, oh yes, I'd really like to come on in. So if you want to raise your hand and maybe just hear a few popcorn shares of what inspired you to show up to this today. Emmanuel,
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah. So the first really formal, if not the first at all, my first experience with sociocracy was with the Deep Transformation Network, Mighty Network, Jeremy Land, and it was maybe a year and a half ago, and there were 3,500 members, and there wasn't a plan that this organization would sit from time to time and just decide where are we, who are we, where are we going, and it was fascinating. So I'd read a little bit about it, but I went right into practicing and it was really fun. So I'm excited. Thank you for offering.
Beautiful. Thank you for that share. And over to you, Vincent. I believe you had your hand up.
Hi, yeah. So for me, it's very useful to finally get to know more about the subject. So we are actually already in an organization that uses holacracy, and I have a website open about sociocracy 3.0 for at least 6 months. And I haven't read it, so it's good to have this kind of event, to make me go through the next steps and learn more. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, very neat. Thank you. I am very curious about holacracy, and yeah, I'm curious how your learnings and my learnings can mesh together. So that's exciting. And Colleen,
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for this offering, Andra. I think that I'm always fascinated by just self-organizing systems, whether in nature or in human societies. And I read a little bit from the Sociocracy website, and I'm just very curious about these sort of small autonomous groups that work together because there's so many different patterns, right, for human organization in terms of self-organization and small groups. So this is really curious, and thank you.
yeah, yay, love that. Yes, it's really exciting, and I like thinking about the social permaculture aspects of it. So for sure. And over to you, Penny.
Hi. I'm here probably from two angles. One is that I am a lawyer and obviously deal with governance structures and things, but in a very sort of in the old world, very formal kind of hierarchical place. So, learning about different forms of governance is incredibly interesting and useful. And secondly, I have started a conversation. I should call it a conversation, but I'm starting to talk with a number of with people I know about who all, I live in London, and we all wish to actually move out of London and start doing some more sort of work on the ground. And so we're looking at setting up an intentional community. And obviously, you know, one of the most used, I think, these days forms of governance, or one of the ones that's used quite a lot is sociocracy. And in fact, one of the members she's already had some experience of it. So I just thought I would come and find out more, because that's obviously one of the big issues: is how do we make decisions and how do we keep ourselves kind of, you know, on track and not fall out and all of that.
Beautiful.
So
Congratulations.
Thank you. So this is great. Thank you.
Yeah, congratulations on getting that started. That's so exciting. And yeah, the intentional community sphere is how I was first introduced to sociocracy, but I've really enjoyed seeing it in volunteer spaces, in nonprofit spaces, co-op spaces, and really just places who are looking for more equity in the decision-making structure. So beautiful. And maybe I'll take one more share if anyone else would like to share why they were inspired to join today.
I can go. So I've had some training and experience with consensus-based decision making through the ICA, Institute of Cultural Affairs, which I've found very powerful. So I'm very curious about how sociocracy fits and meshes within that. So yes, thanks for taking this on. Fantastic.
Yay, thank you for being here. Yeah, very curious to see what you think. So beautiful, beautiful. Okay, I'm just gonna make one change. Okay, all right, let's go ahead and get started here. All right. So you're in the right place. And yeah, we talked about what your inspiration was. So thank you for everyone who shared. That was beautiful. And I just want to spend some time in our introduction here talking about what is governance. So thinking about what do we mean by the term governance, is getting on the same page about this is really important into digging into what sociocracy is. So when we talk about governance, I've heard it talked about the steering process for an organization. So it's the process by which decisions are made and ratified. It's a decision about who's making decisions. And then it's how we review and improve our organization over time. So when I talk about governance, this is kind of the definition that I'm working from or reference. And why might we want to use collaborative governance? Some of you talked about this a little bit in your inspiration. There's people coming together. We want to be more equitable with each other. We want to do decision making in a different non-hierarchical way or less hierarchical way. I've also heard reasons that it's hard to get people engaged on the team, and giving them more agency and more decision making power is one way that can happen. And you might want to be moving away from power over structures like hierarchy. We'll talk about some forms of governance and shifting into a more power with structure. And you want to make informed decisions about the people who are most impacted. So you want to make sure that they have a voice at the table and that you're really considering all of the perspectives in the room. I don't know about you, but I really like to leave meetings feeling like my voice was heard, like I feel inspired, I can feel hopeful. And maybe you've left meetings feeling kind of closed off, feeling kind of frustrated, or like your energy wasn't well spent. So sociocracy is also a way to move through effective meetings and effective governance structures, decision-making structures. And then I think all of us have experiences of this majority rules governance style and how that's not really working. It fosters a situation where there's a us versus them, and that's not really conducive to being in a successful, healthy, environment for an organization and making change in the world, which I think all of us really want to do. So this is something that I say a lot, but I just really want to reiterate it here. No matter how awesome and amazing and inspiring our mission is, if we don't have healthy groups, we can't complete it. So really that's the first step. How do we have healthy groups? How do we begin to transform our culture by transforming the smallest pieces of where we're working in our organizations and in our meetings? So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on this slide. So this just kind of gives you a breakdown of the different styles of governance. So there's autocracy. So a lot of corporations, businesses are running with this very top-down structure. And you can see that like that allows you to make really fast decisions. And there's a chain of hierarchy. It's very clear often who's making the decisions. So those are some of the strengths, but there's no feedback. There's not as much participation, there's not as much choice, and people feel disempowered. And this is honestly how a lot of organizations, even nonprofits, are running right now. And more governments are moving this direction, which is a little bit disconcerting. Then we have democracy, where we have voting and authority and representation, which can be scalable and can work with a lot of people. But again, we have that problem of majority rules. We get this division, we get that us versus them mentality. And we find that representation isn't, I don't know, you end up in situations where you have maybe 12 city council members representing 650,000 people. And just that representation, something gets lost when you multiply it by lots and lots of people. There's not a place for individual concerns to get heard. Then there's the anarchy or no governance system. So sometimes this can work in maybe like mutual aid groups or things where there's just certain standing rules that people follow. Maybe like in one of the mutual aid groups I was in, there's just a rule that if 3 people want to do something, they can run off and do it. And that was the rule. And that was basically the only rule. And it was a really interesting way to see an organization self-organize and see what happened. And we definitely ran into things that were really confusing and some things got dropped. But it was really interesting to see that it still worked. Like there were still things that happened out of that. And so it's not always the wrong style. And sometimes this is where groups start. They're like, okay, well, let's just do it this way until something goes wrong. And that's not always a bad plan. Then whole group consensus. So this is as we're really starting to get into more of the collaborative governance modes. This isn't one that people have heard of. So really thinking about, we want to get to a decision where every single person is on board. You might have these really big plenary meetings where literally everyone in the organization is present. And you might have like, really rapid decision-making processes. You might like hold up fingers of like, I like this idea this much. There's all kinds of different ways that consensus happens in practice. But it can be really hard to have decisions made. You have to have really, really, really strong facilitation to manage like groups of that size. And then if one person is like, I really don't like this, then they can stop all of the momentum of the whole group. And there are some modified consensus models that help with some of those problems. But the one that I'm most familiar with is sociocracy. So in sociocracy, we're making decisions by consent instead of consensus. I'll talk a little bit about the difference of those two things, but just know that that's a major difference. And then in sociocracy, you have circles. So the organization ends up being split into individual circles that have aims and domains. And so each circle has complete authority over its domain, over its particular niche. And then there's communication processes that happen between the circles so that information can flow and the organization can be healthy. And so we'll talk a lot about how this looks. And so I'm not going to go into it a ton here, but really the key points, the key strengths here are that this is a way to make effective decisions in small groups and to make sure that you're hearing from all members of the teams that have experience, that have expertise, that have opinions, that have a stake in what's going on. And it's a way to really encourage people to get involved, to give them their agency, to empower them. It's a really powerful mode of re-acclimatizing everyone to their sense of empowerment, because our structures right now are disempowering us, and it can be really difficult to take that agency back. And so sociocracy is one attempt to do that. So as I talk about sociocracy, the word socio is those who associate, and then cracy is govern, so governance. And so those who associate together govern together. So this is really a peer governance structure. That's what sociocracy means. And then sociocracy has three pillars. So it has consent, transparency, and feedback. So we talked a little bit about consent. I have another slide that's going to go deeper into that, but really thinking about, we're not looking for it to match up with everyone's preferences perfectly. We're just looking for something that is within everyone's range of tolerance. Like, is this something that feels good enough for now and safe enough to try? Can we experiment? Organizations are giant experiments. We're trying to change the nature of reality in some way together as a group. And so what does it mean to engage in an experiment and accept that it might fail? And that's okay. But what is good enough for now? What is safe enough to try in alignment with our aims, our goals, our vision, our mission? Transparency, we're facilitating communication between circles. We're facilitating communication among inside of individual circles. And we're also facilitating communication with the organizations beyond us. So our partnerships, our collaborations beyond the organization itself. And then feedback. Feedback is the mode through which we learn. Feedback is how we review, how we iterate. And what I love about sociocracy is it's really not an out-of-the-box solution. It's a situation where you get to iterate, you get to try things out, you get to adapt it to your specific situation. And there's so many different ways that you do feedback so that you can learn about what's working, what's not working, and make adjustments along the way. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So as I mentioned, I have this slide about what consent is. And I do want to say I will send a link. I will post a link to the slides at the inside of the design school. So in case you want to save them for later and review them, you're welcome to. So moving into what consent is. So if you have, there's this idea on the table and it's not your favorite idea. You're like, well, I really like Golden Graham cereal, or I really like oatmeal, but the option on the table is eggs and toast. And I don't love eggs and toast, but eggs and toast is good for me. I can eat those things. I feel good about that. It's in my range of tolerance of what I will eat for breakfast, right? So I have a preference, and maybe the option on the table, eggs and toast, is not my favorite breakfast, but it's still in my range of tolerance. I still feel like I can eat eggs and toast. And maybe you feel like you can't eat eggs and toast. Maybe you're gluten-free. Maybe you're vegan. And so in that case, you might have an objection. Like, nope, sorry, I can't eat eggs and toast. We need to figure out a new plan. So that's kind of just a really simple example of how preference, range of tolerance, and objection makes sense. And the consent is that talking about that range of tolerance. And in consensus, or in like really pure consensus models, you're really looking for everyone's preferences to agree, which is why sometimes the decision-making process it becomes really difficult. And then just to see what consent then looks like in a group space. So in this example, there are three people's different preferences and then ranges of tolerance. And so the darker areas are the person's preferences, and then the lighter areas are a range of tolerance. And so if you're thinking about this, like, how does this look in a group space? Then the darkest area, that would be like, okay, this is the absolute perfect decision because we all like this, we all have this preference, and we share this preference. And that is a very narrow swath of options. Like, that is very difficult to find. It can take a lot of time to find it. And it's very tricky. And sometimes it's hidden and small. Whereas everyone's shaded range of tolerance, and where those overlap, that is a bigger space that the group can take up, that the group can find, that the group can maneuver around and experiment inside of. So it gives us a little bit of a bigger playground to talk about range of tolerance rather than what is your preference. So some clarity around that. Okay, so maybe all of this sounds great to you. I know it sounded great to me when I started learning about it. So then the question becomes, okay, but what does this look like in practice? How do we actually do this? And actually, before we move on, I think that I just want to take a moment and pause and maybe invite us to do a little bit of a visualization. So go ahead and maybe soften your gaze or close your eyes. I'm just going to ask you some questions and just feel how it feels in your body. Where does it show up in your body? How do you feel? I want you to think about how do you want to feel when you leave a meeting? If you imagine getting off a Zoom call or leaving a space where you just collaborated with other people, how do you want to feel? And just paying some attention to that sensation in your body and beginning to get curious about how do we cultivate that sensation. Then asking yourself, how do you want to feel toward your collaborators when you leave a meeting? How do you want to feel in your body toward your collaborators when you exit a group space? And then how might it feel to get kind and thoughtful feedback from your collaborators? Knowing that you're in a community that cares for you and your well-being, how does it feel in your body to receive kind and thoughtful feedback? Maybe taking a deep breath, gently letting your eyes flutter open. So sociocracy is really a way to try to foster those feelings, those sensations in your body and those sensations in your mind so that we can leave meetings feeling resourced, feeling all of those feelings that came up for you. And I think we get into this mode of thinking that meetings have to be boring, meetings have to be uncomfortable, collaboration has to be difficult, and it's not true. And we can really work toward this sensation of fullness. Okay, I will go to Michelle with the question in just one moment, but maybe you could drop into the chat just maybe one word about some of the emotions or some of the feelings that came up for you as you imagined how you want to feel leaving a meeting. And just drop those into the chat. I definitely felt this sense of aliveness, of like a very full heart. I'm seeing energized, hopeful, connected, peaceful, confident, trust, inspiration, energized, resolvement. It's a new word for me. Resolvement. Love it. Okay, beautiful. Thank you for doing that little experiment with me. Lightness, clarity, joy. Love this. Great. Yes. Okay, I'm going to go over to Michelle for a question.
Thanks very much. So it's kind of a question of clarification. because I did many years of work as a facilitator and a mediator, and we did conflict resolution training. And I'm not too sure whether my definition of consensus is wide enough that it overlaps with your definition of sociocracy, or if there's a difference. Because I realize that sometimes people use different words for something similar. So one of my co-facilitators that I used to run training with was a Quaker. So I'm not a Quaker, but he basically said, that tradition, which is hundreds of years old around consensus, is you get people to indicate, like, maybe some people are really so passionately in favor that they'll work hard to make it happen. Other people, it's okay, but they're not going to work at all, and there'll be lots of people in the middle, and then people who are like, I don't like it, I'm not going to say anything about it, and then I hate it so much, I'm going to try to destroy the idea, kind of that whole continuum. And he said basically that, like the Quaker tradition was you would work so that people could live with it. And that you had enough people that liked it enough to do the work, which sounds more like sociocracy than maybe probably a conventional description of consensus. So I just wanted to check in on that.
Yeah, I think that you're right. And actually, sociocracy was originally inspired by a Quaker school. So I do think that there's some overlap there. And yeah, I think that there's like I said, there's a lot of different versions of modified consensus, and there's a lot of different ways that that's practiced. And some of them do start to look a lot like sociocracy. I think where I see for myself the biggest difference between sociocracy and kind of that model that you were talking about is the circle structure, which we'll get more into in part 2, which happens in a couple of weeks. Today, we're really focusing on kind of like the meetings and the facilitation and those sorts of things. So there might be some really, really great overlaps for you in what you've learned. And thank you for bringing that in, for sure.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges is when people use the word consensus, they tend to not be thinking of the model and so you end up spending a lot of time and a lot of work, and maybe having a different starting point or definition would just avoid people thinking they know what you're talking about, when really it's something different. So thanks very much. That's really.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that in. And yeah, I mean, that sense of clarity is really something that governance craves to carve out in the organization. So I think it's an important thing to bring in as well. So I will continue sharing my screen here. All right. So yeah, how do we start? How does this actually look in practice? And how can we actually foster those feelings that we've named in the chat in our meeting spaces? So what do we need? How do we start? With sociocracy, if you're starting from scratch, you want a group of 4 or more people, usually. It's really hard to make the meetings and the conversations around happen with 3 or fewer. And so 4 is good. You can have, everyone can hold certain meeting roles. You can distribute out the operational roles. 4 is really great. More than 4 is also great. You want to have people who want to do something together. So what is it that we want to do? And how is our specific organization attempting to change reality? Like, that's really the question that we're asking when we form an organization is, hey, we're seeing this need. How do we meet it? How do we just change reality a little bit together? What is the thing that we want to focus on? And so then you also just need a willingness to experiment for a period of time. So maybe that's really defined for your group. Maybe you're like, you know what, we're going to try this for a year. Let's do it. Or it's like, it's more indefinite. Like, yeah, let's do this for as long as it works. So that's really all you need to get started in any kind of organization, but I would say especially sociocracy. I also want to name that I've seen organizations get really excited about sociocracy, and then it falls apart for various reasons. And these are just some of the reasons that I've noticed can cause problems. So as we're thinking about, okay, we want to try this, we need to make sure that as an organization, we have some shared values. So we have in a organization that's ready to try out sociocracy, they all are excited about the idea of collective decision-making and empowerment. They're interested in being committed to the process. So understanding that there is going to be friction, there is going to be conflict in any situation where you're collaborating in a group space, and there's a commitment to work through it. There's a commitment to keep trying. And then there's growth mindset, which is really similar, but this desire to iterate and experiment and grow and evolve as an organization, change over time. And then just in general, respect for diverse perspectives. Because when you enter into a collaborative governance structure where you're focused on equity, you really want to make sure that everyone actually wants to hear the voices in the room. And if any of these things are kind of not quite there fully in your group, it can be really difficult to implement sociocracy. So this might be like a smaller baby step. And fully implementing sociocracy in this case might be maybe you have a study group about how do we care for all people in a situation, or how do we broaden our perspectives on whose voices are important, or how do we talk about how do we care for others, how do we commit to community care, how do we do some how do we commit to conflict resolution as a process, even if we don't know exactly how conflict resolution works. So just know in the back of your head that these are really important values before you really get started with your group of four. Because if you enter into a situation where someone says, actually, I don't want you to have decision-making power, that's really difficult to work with. And it's going to be really difficult to implement sociocracy at that point. So just know that. Okay, so I'm going to focus this part mostly on single circle organizations. So in a situation where you have 4 to 10 people, and you're focused on really one particular thing. So this is going to be for most groups that are just starting out, you're probably only going to have one circle. And then in part 2, I'll talk about what it looks like when you actually have multiple circles. So in a single circle situation, you have, again, I would say 4 to 10 people. The reason for keeping it that small of a number is that you are doing conversational rounds and you're really hearing from everybody. So the more people you have, the more time it takes to get through a round where everyone says how they feel about something, right? So you want to keep your meetings kind of succinct and small and tight. So it's going to be 4 to 10. And as I say in the slide, if you have more people, that means you need more circles. And then you're focused on one particular aim or goal. What is the one way that you're attempting to change reality together? And you're having these facilitated conversations with questions and reactions. And I will kind of show you what that looks like. So I've talked a little bit about conversational rounds, and this is probably the most quintessential tool to sociocracy. And as a facilitator, this is the thing that will solve almost every problem. Really thinking about if there's tension between people, if people are getting into it back and forth, if you're sensing that the energy in the circle is off, returning to these conversational rounds is really wildly successful. And I've role played out some really tense situations where we imagine like, okay, this personality type is in the room, and how do we navigate this? Or this really dramatic situation is happening, and how do we navigate this? And time again, it come back to the conversation rounds. Give everyone a chance to speak. Make people feel trust that their voice will be heard, that they will have a turn in the circle, and that everyone is building trust that they care about each other's input. So this is a really, really powerful tool. Can't stress that enough. So what does that look like in practice? So we talk about questions, reactions, and consent. So if you have a conversation topic, and I'll give you some examples later, but maybe we're talking about, what do we eat for breakfast? We'll go back to that example. So we're going to understand the proposal. So someone is introducing a proposal to the group. They're going to come in and say, I have eggs, I have toast. Let's make eggs and toast for everyone for breakfast today. And then the facilitator, who's usually a different person, will say, okay, does anyone in the circle have questions about that proposal? So want to make sure that we're all in the same reality about this proposal. Do we all understand what's on the table? So you might go around, and on Zoom, this is a little bit challenging, but you can call people's names in the boxes, right? And I usually write down people's names on a little whiteboard and just kind of like tally mark, like, how has this person spoken yet? Yes, no. But there's lots of different ways to keep track of that. And in a physical situation, you can just go around the circle like, okay, do you have a thought? Do you have a thought? Do you have a thought? And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. So, okay, does everyone understand that the proposal on the table is eggs and toast? Then people will ask questions. The questions will get answered by the person who gave the proposal. And then, okay, all the questions have been answered. We're all in the same reality. Let's do a reaction round. So you get to make comments now. So the question round, really just questions. And the facilitator is really trying to keep people on task with, we're just asking questions right now. I hear that you have a preference. Thank you for stating your preference. You can bring that in the reaction round. We're focusing on questions right now. And so the reaction round, you get to say what you feel. I don't really like eggs and toast. Like, I'll eat eggs and toast, but it's not my favorite, right? And that's okay. And that's just, there's nothing that needs to be done about that. You just get to say what you feel. Or, you know what, pass, I don't care. Whatever works. So you're really hearing reactions from everyone in the group, and then you decide. So then the facilitator will say, okay, are there any objections? And you go around the circle in the same way, and you decide if you have consent or if you don't have consent. And I'll talk a little bit about how to navigate objections, but this is just the basic processes of these conversation rounds. So clarifying questions, reactions, consent. Those are the three big parts of the conversation round. So then in your meeting, this is just a really simplistic meeting template. So in a sociocratic meeting, ideally you have a check-in. You want to feel into how everyone is showing up to the meeting. What energy are they bringing in? This can, again, we want to create a sense of shared reality. And so that's really what the check-in is for. This can be really brief. These can be emojis. This can be just emotion words. It can be a little bit more personal, like, yeah, you know what? I have a headache today. Not feeling 100%, but I'm here and I'm grateful to be here. Or it can be like, yeah, I mean, something really difficult happened this morning and I'm just coming in with that energy. And it really helps me to know that you know that I'm maybe a little emotional today. So it's just really, again, helping create that shared reality. And then you do announcements and action item review. This is kind of standard for most meetings. Announcements, especially, like, does anyone need to leave early? Because that might change where things have to be in the agenda. And then action item review. What did we get done? What did we say we were going to get done? Did we get it done? Are there barriers to getting it done? Are we in integrity with ourselves as an organization? And then we're going to consent to the agenda. So this is a round. And so consenting to the agenda, are there any objections to what's on the agenda? The agenda is ideally pre-populated by the leader or the navigator of the group and the secretary. Usually it's a collaborative process, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So maybe you reorder the agenda at this point because someone needs to leave early. Maybe you say like, well, this isn't super important, so maybe let's put it at the end in case there's not time. And ideally, each of the agenda items has a time allotted and a person who's responsible for introducing it. So that way it's clear who's introducing the topic, how much time we have, and how we're going to move through it as a group. And then there's 3 different types of agenda items in Sociocracy. So there's a report back, which is just, hey, I'm coming in from this other circle, and here's some decisions that we made that you might like to know about. And that's it. It's just a report back. And so with a report back, you really only do a question round. So we're creating that sense of shared reality. Does everyone understand that report back? Great, we'll move on. Then the second type is exploration. So this is a situation where you don't have a full proposal, you don't have a full plan. You're kind of like, well, I know I want to make breakfast for everybody on Sunday, but I don't really know what I want to make. And so it's just kind of like, how do people feel about breakfast on Sunday together? Does that feel good? Do we like that? It's kind of like a temperature check, right? So then we'll do a question round. Does everyone understand the plan? Does everyone understand what this person wants to do? And then a reaction round. How do you feel about that? But there's really not anything to decide yet. That person is going to come back to the next meeting with their proposal that's a little more planned out and their like menu of what breakfast is going to look like. So there's nothing to decide. So that's an exploration. And then the proposal is the full thing. You're introducing your proposal, your full plan. You're doing a question round, a reaction round, and a consent round because you are deciding something as a group. So those are the differences. Then you might do a backlog review. Do we have enough time to pull in something from our backlog that we can talk about together? An action item read back. What did we decide we wanted to do and who's going to do it? And then meeting feedback, which for me is the most important thing about a meeting is the feedback. Because I want to know, how did I do as a facilitator? How do people feel leaving the meeting? And for me, this is the number one way that you create a shared context, that you create a shared reality together. Because I don't know about you, but there have been meetings where I left the meeting and I felt awful. I felt like, wow, I don't think we got anything done. I don't feel like I'm closer to those people. I don't feel like my voice was heard. And there's really nowhere for me to talk about that. I just have to hold that emotion. It's just in my body now. Whereas if we do a round of meeting feedback where we can say like, hey, I really appreciated how you interrupted that really tense back and forth. And that really helped me stay present in the meeting. Then that can really help shape people's facilitation. It can shape our group context, and it can help us going forward in our shared reality together. Okay, I will share my screen slightly differently for sound. I want to show you like, okay, what does this look like in practice? So there's just a quick 2.5-minute video that I want to share with you all. Just give me a moment here. All right.
Okay, next on the agenda is Luciano, and he's got something for us on the learning stipend. Luciano?
Yeah, thank you, Elena. Well, as you know, I'm an advocate of this issue. The present learning stipend is 500. Many people use it, and it's not enough. Many people don't use it, I have to say. But for people who use it, it seems a lot, but it's not. So the proposal is to raise it from 500 to 750. And that's a bit, that's all. That's the proposal.
Thanks, Luciano.
Check.
Was that proposal clear for everybody? Do we have any questions on that? All right, let's do a reaction round then. This time, let's go Lizzie and then Adam, and then I'll go, and then Michael, and we'll all finish with Luciano. Lizzie?
Yeah, I think it's really exciting and useful, and I feel like it will help people find some more valuable courses to help them. Check.
Thanks, Lizzie. Adam, and then I'll go.
Yeah, I mean, like we were talking about it last meeting, the financials look good for it. All the people who weren't using it kind of cover the people who are going to use some extra, so that's great from my end. And I'm looking forward to taking a couple extra courses that I got my eye on. So check.
Great, thanks. Yeah, same. I think it's a good idea. I know we talked about that we've got room in the budget for it, so I think it's great. So check. Michael?
Yeah, thank you for putting this together. I feel like it's really clear and it'll be good for our circle and for the org.
All right, and Luciano?
Yeah, just glad that it went through. Nothing to add. Thank you.
All right, then let's do a consent round, and we'll go same order: Lizzie, Adam, me, Michael, and then Luciano. So Lizzie?
Yep, consent.
Great. Adam?
I consent.
I consent as well. Michael?
I consent.
And Luciano?
Let me think about it. I think I'll consent, yeah.
All right. Well, then it sounds like we'll be good with moving from that 500 to 750 a year.
Okay. Screen. Okay.
Okay, next.
Okay. So, all right. Yeah, so that just gave you sort of an example of how that can look in practice. And obviously this was a very simplistic example. and they didn't have objections. They didn't do a full round of questions. Sometimes people combine the question and comment round. It just depends on the dynamics of your group and how that feels for you. Like I said, this isn't necessarily an out of the box formula. This is something you adapt to your own group culture. But there was a desire to ask for, does everyone understand? And you can call people's names during the question round as well, if that's helpful. But they did do the comment reaction round. They did do the consent round. Yeah, I think I just want to have one more slide and then I'll open it up to questions. And I see that there's a question in the chat also. So give me one more moment and we'll have a little question break. Oh, I'm so sorry. So funny to share it differently for videos versus the presentation. Here we are. Okay. So I just want to name that in that little example that we watched, there were two pretty clear roles that were happening. So there was the facilitator, so the person who is facilitating the rounds, keeping tabs on the energy of the group, restating the proposal, keeping everyone on task, and calling individual names. And sometimes when you're the facilitator and it's time for you to go into the comment round, you need to be really clear about like, okay, taking my facilitator hat off for a moment, here's how I feel about this proposal. And then you'll put your facilitator hat back on and you'll keep going. This didn't feel like there was a need for it, but in some spaces it can be really helpful to distinguish what is me as a facilitator versus what is me as an individual who has an opinion on this. So that's just something to note if you end up in a facilitator space in sociocracy. And then there was the secretary who was taking notes and was maybe they assisted in the agenda creation ahead of the meeting, and they're also kind of keeping time for the meeting, and they're doing the backlog management ahead of time. So that's kind of one of the roles in sociocracy. And like I said, everything in sociocracy is very adaptable. So sometimes some of these roles might get jumbled in terms of like, well, actually, someone else is going to take notes and the secretary is just going to focus on timekeeping, or they're just going to focus on agenda creation. So it really can be adapted to your group, but in sociocracy, this is kind of how they divide it up. And then I just want to also mention that there's a difference between meeting roles and operational roles. So meeting roles are like facilitator, secretary, navigator, and delegate. I'll talk about those other ones in part 2. So it's more relevant when you have multiple circles. And then operational roles are like, well, we need someone to pay the invoices. So that's a role. That might also be something that someone's elected into. Talk a little bit about elections later today. But yeah, so thinking about like people can hold multiple roles. You might hold some meeting roles. You might hold some operational roles. You might just hold operational roles. You might just hold meeting roles. And those are just how it's divvied up in sociocracy. Okay. So I'm going to stop and just ask if there's some questions before I continue. And I will start with this one in the chat. Can there be conditional consent? Yes, this is a great question. This is definitely something we've practiced in some of like the advanced role play facilitation situations. So frequently this happens when you have multiple circles and there's like a budget issue. So it's like, okay, yes, we love this idea on the condition that this other circle approves it because they're in charge of the finances, right? So there's sort of, you can build those conditions into your proposal. And so you can go and check in with that other circle to make sure that that can go through. But yeah, that is kind of a tricky situation. It's sometimes difficult to handle, and it's good to get practice on those sorts of things.
So that was my question. And I was actually thinking of it in your very simple, of course, you come up with a simple example and then someone makes it complicated. But when you said eggs and toast, and it's kind of like, and maybe you deal with it in the reaction, but it's like, if I can have the eggs any way I want and gluten-free toast, I agree. But if if it has to be wheat toast and there's no gluten-free and the eggs have to be, I don't know, runny. So yeah. Would that be handled more in the reaction level or yeah?
Yeah, so yes, it can really happen either way. It can happen in the reaction round, and then like maybe the person who introduced the proposal will say like, okay, I want to modify my proposal a little bit before we do the consent round. I want to make sure that, like, yes, you get eggs to order and I'm going to have gluten-free toast, right? And then you'd have a modified proposal and then you'd ask for consent. Or if you say in the reaction round, like, I need gluten-free toast, and gluten-free toast is not in the proposal when it goes to the consent round, then you can object. So you can say, like, actually, hey, like, this is really, like, I really can't consent unless I know there's gluten-free toast. In which case, that's when you would modify the proposal. And I'll talk about how to integrate objections like that. So you can either take care of it in one of those two places, if that makes sense. Yeah, great question. And over to you, David.
So I'm thinking of a situation where there's unequal power within the circle. I just think of a situation that I was in where we were meeting around a grant proposal, and I was really, I guess, one of the minor players in this. It turned out that we didn't get the grant because we weren't philosophically aligned with what we were supposed to be doing. Well, I could see it, I knew it, but I didn't think it was my place. And so, I mean, many months afterwards, I could imagine myself saying, if I was grading this proposal, I would not accept it because ... So I guess, how do we deal with that kind of imbalance?
Yeah, also a great question. I'm like, ooh, these are good. I'm like getting chilled. Anyway, so yeah, so we have in sociocracy, or just in general, what we call explicit power and implicit power. So explicit power is like, yes, you have the authority to make this decision and everyone knows that. And then there's implicit power, which is more cultural. It's more about, it could be your positionality in the room. Like, how are you maybe a more privileged person in the room than other people in the room? Or how has the fact that you've been at this organization longer influenced the power in the room? And those are really unspoken. They most of the time go unnoticed or unnamed. And that can be really difficult. And so that can create cultural situations where someone who's new to the organization doesn't feel empowered to speak up or object about something. So that is not necessarily something that a sociocratic situation is going to fix. Like that, that is something that you're going to have to build into the culture. And there's some tools that sociocracy can help to like facilitate that. But if there's a situation where you always have the founder of an organization in the room and they often bring the proposal and everyone just goes with what they say and they're too afraid to object, then no amount of, structure in your meetings is going to help to break through that. What can help is, like, I do think once people are getting used to the style of the rounds and getting used to speaking up in the meetings and having a turn where they don't have to popcorn, they don't have to raise their hand, they just know they're going to get a turn to talk, that can really help. And then maybe they start bringing their concerns to the reaction round and they're like, hey, actually, I'm feeling a little bit nervous about that. So they can still say it even if they're not prepared to object. So that can be like a little baby step that direction, is just really focusing on those rounds. And then I would say that the other thing that you can do is, I think in this example, that a sense of defined membership could help. So we talk about defined membership as making it really clear who's in the circle and who's not in the circle. So in an intentional community situation, this might be like, well, you aren't a consenting member of the circle until you've been at the community for 3 months or for 6 months. So there's a clear point at which you become a full member, which can help to balance and equalize that power. Okay, it's really clear what that threshold is. So okay, now I feel more empowered to bring my objection to the space. But yeah, it is a really tricky thing to manage culturally. And I think it's really important to talk about the fact that when we're talking about governance and switching governance structures, we're really changing culture. This isn't just, so you flip a switch and suddenly you're sociocracy, you're using sociocracy, you're really changing the culture, and this takes time. And it takes time for people to trust their own agency, their own empowerment, and their own ability to speak in a group and to facilitate safety, or at least, some amount of brave space in an environment like that. Does that help to answer your question, David? Beautiful. Thank you for bringing that in. And Emmanuel.
Thank you. A little bit what came to my mind with David's question was, I'm new to sociocracy and I'm new to pro-social behavior, but I've spent more time with pro-social behavior. So they're very close, right? Like, I often even get confused now. I'm taking, but so because the role of the facilitator is really to make sure that everyone is heard, right? And everyone is happy. Like if somebody has a skill, that this person is able to tell the others that they have a skill, so everybody gets out happy. But do you think, like in my coaching, group coaching, if we know the attendees a little bit more with maybe a few questions of their context or their background before the session, it's always helpful because you know that this person, like David, with his experience, maybe I could have cued it in, or he would have been less shy, and he could have contributed something to the person before with a question or two, so that is that fine?
Yeah, so yeah, there's a lot of pieces to that question. I want to say that I haven't studied pro-social very deeply, but my understanding is that pro-social is sort of like an umbrella that sociocracy can fit into. And sociocracy is a little bit more practical, whereas pro-social is kind of a set of behaviors. And I also have seen pro-social used more in like, okay, we're going to focus on like how as an individual we can foster these pro-social behaviors. And sociocracy is kind of coming at it from starting at the group level. But that's just how I understand that they kind of fit together, but I think they're very related and kind of nested inside of each other. And then with the facilitation role, I do think that the facilitator is really managing the group's energy. So they're paying attention to, you know, does there feel like there's tension in the room? Does it feel like the group is losing steam? Does it feel like we need to transition? Does it feel like we need another comment round or another reaction round? They're kind of just like managing the group energy. And I think what's really important is it's easy as a facilitator to feel like it's all on you. Like you have to decide everything, like you have to make sure everything happens. But really, your goal is just to facilitate the group making decisions. You're just trying to hold the container for the group to do what it needs to do. And so I think that, you know, if as a facilitator, you're like, hey, maybe we can start a meeting to talk about how everyone or what everyone's skills are. Maybe just name a few skills that you have. Or something that's been really, really successful, especially in like brand new groups, is we start the circle talking about like, what is one thing that would be helpful for everyone in the group to know about you? Like accessibility wise, like, okay, you know, I'm a little bit hard of hearing, so if you can speak up, that would really help me out. Or, hey, you know, I tend to cry really easily, and it would just really help me out if you knew that about me, so that if I start crying, you don't think it's a big deal, right? So that can really help to just like, again, we're creating that shared reality, that shared context. So as a facilitator, if you see like, you know what, I'm noticing that there's some people who are a little more shy in the group than others, and maybe there's a question I can ask at the beginning of the meeting to kind of ground us in and create that shared context in that collaborative environment, then yeah, absolutely bring it in. I think it's a little bit dangerous to bring it in like the middle of the meeting because it might kind of derail some things, but maybe that's necessary. Maybe that's important. And I do think as a facilitator, that's kind of your prerogative. So yeah, thanks for that question. I see a question in the chat, but I'm going to go over to Dave and then I'll go to the question in the chat and then we'll go to Pamela.
Thank you. One thing that came up for me, I don't know, maybe this for a question for down the road, but I'm curious if there's any like real world examples of like municipal governments using sociocracy.
I don't know of municipal governments using it. I think that it might be helpful to start sort of more at like the neighborhood association level or like an HOA level and kind of build up from there. But there are some very large organizations using it, and I would be curious about a municipal version of it. So yeah, I will ask my instructor if they know of any, and I will post that in the design school if I find something. But thank you for that question. I'm very curious about it. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go to this question in the chat. What if we don't all agree? Does it have to be unanimous? So, like, yes and no. So we're talking about, and actually I will go a lot more into how to integrate objections and working with objections in a moment. But as I talked about, like we have consent, which is different than consensus. So again, consensus is everyone has the same preference. We all agree on this particular solution. Consent is more, this is safe enough to try. This is good enough for now. This is not going to harm our organization. So it's not so much that like, oh, everyone's agreeing. It's that everyone has a shared range of tolerance. And I will maybe save more about like talking about objections for the next set of slides, but we'll dig into that a little bit. And over to you, Pamela.
I'm really enjoying this. Thanks a lot for putting it on. One of the things that was catching my ear was the repetition of creating a shared reality and how utterly easy it is to forget that our sense of reality is very slippery and can change on a dime within a meeting. And what I'm really appreciating is coming to see how the processes that you're describing at every step brings everybody into the room to reestablish that core understanding. And I guess that's where I see a strong overlap with pro-social in terms of having a shared identity and purpose. This is kind of foundational to being able to build that shared identity and purpose. So it sounds so easy, but man alive, when you're in a room with a bunch of people and everything starts to shift, the energy can really be hard to, it takes a lot of practice. I really appreciate the discipline that's called for with this.
Yeah. And I want to say that Sociocracy for Al has these role play facilitation practice sessions that are really exciting and fun, and you get to play out some of these like difficult situations. It's like a 6-week course. It's like $100, and you get just cheaper if you join in a group. But it was really valuable for me to just like really throw myself into difficult situations and feel what that feels like as a facilitator and really like work through that. And so yeah, there's really exciting people in this community to like help foster that that kind of like discipline that you're talking about. But yeah, I really appreciate your comments. And yeah, I want to say that I know that a lot of this can seem like, well, there's a lot of steps here and there's a lot of ways to implement this. And there's a lot of, there's like this template and there's the rounds and there's a lot to remember. But I think like if you were only going to do one thing, you're going to come out of this with one thing, I would say meeting feedback at the end of the meeting. Like just doing a round of meeting feedback to start building that shared reality and to start getting feedback about how people are feeling at the end of the meeting, that alone can really start shifting a culture. So it can be simple. It can start easy. And, it doesn't have to be we fully implemented sociocracy. Like you can start changing culture just a little piece at a time. So yeah. Okay. Beautiful. Lovely questions. Thanks for all of this energy. It's great. I'm going to continue in the slides and then we'll have some time for questions at the end as well and feedback. So I'll jump in. So as I promised, I'm going to talk a little bit about objections. So in sociocracy, we talk about objections or being gifts. So as Dave mentioned, it's really scary. David mentioned it's really scary to bring in an objection sometimes. But if you really create a culture of objections are a gift, it's a way to say to the group, I really am afraid of that this idea might harm our group or the people that we serve in our organization. It's not based on your personal preference. It's not like, well, I prefer this other idea, therefore I'm going to object. It's really based on, I don't think this is safe enough to try. I really don't. And that is a gift. Your perspective is a gift. And so that's really kind of the culture that you're building in sociocracy and why objections are there. So in my silly little breakfast example, you might object if you're like, hey, the proposal did not include gluten-free toast, and that's going to create an unsafe environment for me or a place where I might have to go get breakfast somewhere else and I can't fully participate in this meeting, right? So that could be the thing, but it could also be like, well, I just really don't feel comfortable. Like I really think that I need vegan food, or whatever it is. Like there's a objection, and then it's the group's responsibility to work through that objection together. It's not the person who objects responsibility necessarily. So just to kind of show you what the process of working through objections is, I really like this example. So we've talked about the conversational rounds being questions, being comments or reactions, and being consent. Those are like the three stages of the decision-making process, right? So this is also, you can say it as understanding, exploring, and deciding. So when you have an objection, you actually go through the same process again. So you're going to understand the objection. You do a round of questions. Does everyone understand why this person is objecting? We're going to have a reaction round. What are the ideas in the group for how to amend the proposal so that we can move through this objection, incorporate the objection, and then the new proposal goes to a consent round. So that's just kind of like, so you're really just kind of breaking it down. So we're going to do questions, reactions, decision, consent. And then if there's an objection, so you do it again. Questions, reaction, consent. So that's like the basic formula for how to move through an objection. And then as you're thinking about the amendments for the objection, and again, it is the group's responsibility. It's not the facilitator's responsibility to fix the objection. It's not the objector's responsibility to fix the objection. It is the whole group's responsibility. We're all changing reality together. So some options. You can modify the proposal. So, okay, we're going to make sure we have gluten-free toast. You can shorten the term. You can say, okay, well, the breakfast example isn't working great for this, but let's see. So for the learning stipend that was mentioned in the video that I mentioned, that I showed you, so they were shifting it from $500 to $750. So maybe doing that indefinitely is a little scary to some people. Maybe they're like, hey, I'm just nervous about the impact that's going to have on our budget long term. So maybe they're like, okay, let's raise it for 6 months and see what happens and collect some data, and then we'll put it on the agenda for 6 months to reevaluate and see if that was successful or how we want to change it going forward. So shortening the term can help the person who's objecting feel a little safer to continue in that decision. And then you can measure the concern. So for instance, if you're like, well, we want to put on this circus event, and you're making that decision, but someone's like, well, are we sure about the safety of the participants? So are we sure that, like everyone is going to be safe and that all the performers are going to be safe? So you might be able to measure the concern, to gather data about that, maybe at a future meeting, and then make a decision about that. So it's really just, is this safe enough to try? Is it good enough for now? No? Okay, how do we all come together to get it to a place where it is safe enough to try and good enough for now? And then worst case, well, okay, not worst case, but like another option, I guess, is that you put the objector and someone else, you make kind of a subcommittee to go and rebuild the proposal incorporating this objection. Because oftentimes in a meeting, you don't have time to fully integrate the objection on the spot. Sometimes you can, and that's great. Sometimes it takes a little more thought. So it's like, okay, we're going to create a team who are going to go and work on revising the proposal and bring it back to the next meeting. That happens a lot. Or absolute worst case, you drop the proposal. Okay, we can't figure out how to modify this proposal. Maybe we can't do it. And that's an absolute last resort in sociocracy. Really, really want to be moving through with decisions and making sure that we are changing reality as an organization, because that's really the goal. You can only do that if you're making decisions. So that's integrating objections. All right, and then so there's roles and people hold them. And so how do we decide who holds a role in a group? So first, you're going to establish what the role is. What is that person going to be doing? What do they have purview over? Is this a paid role? So just defining the role. And that can be an exploration process in the group space. So you can all talk about it. You can all kind of brainstorm together in a round. And then similarly, what qualifications are necessary to succeed in this role? What does this person need to know about in order to do this role well? So if they're facilitating a sociocratic meeting, well, they probably need to know about sociocracy. So That would be a qualification, right? And then the term, how long will they serve? And when will we do a feedback process with this person or some kind of performance review? So those are the 3 things you need to know before you do the selection process. The actual selection process itself happens like this. So you'll do a round, and everyone, based on the shared reality of the role, the terms, and the qualifications, everyone knows that. That's all public knowledge. Then you say, okay, this person, I think this person would be great for this role. And you'd say why. I really, they've trained in sociocracy. I think they've just done a really good job with their facilitation. They're very aware of the group's energy. I think they do a great job. And so the facilitator would then be tallying up who says what and who gets nominated. And then after we've done the whole round where everyone gets nominated, then you do a change round. And you can nominate yourself. You can say like, hey, I've really studied sociocracy. I really feel excited about taking on this role, and I nominate myself. That's totally an option. So then after hearing everybody's nomination, you do a change round. Does anybody want to change their vote based on what they heard during the nomination round? Like maybe you're like, oh, well, that person wants to nominate themselves. Well, that's great. Like I would love to put you in that role. Like I'm going to change my vote from this person to this person. And then once you have all the tallies up and you see who has the most tallies, then you ask the whole group, do you consent to this person serving in this role? And that includes the person who has been nominated. So if they're like, wow, I am so flattered that you nominated me to be facilitator and I super do not have time, then okay, that's an objection, great. And then you move on to the next person who has more tallies. And so this is how ideally each role gets decided. So again, you have your facilitator, you have your secretary, you might have some operational roles in the circle, and this is the selection process. And it's actually very interesting, and I wished I had more time to show you how that looks in practice, because I had a little like role play session for us to do, but I didn't have access to breakout rooms for whatever reason today. But you can kind of imagine was going to send you into breakout groups, and you'd pick a spokesperson to report back to the main group with. And so you would maybe do a round of like, what are your spokesperson skills? What are your speaking skills? How comfortable are you with speaking? And then you would each nominate somebody. And then based on the nomination round, you might do a change round and then consent. And then, okay, you have a spokesperson, and that person would come back and share, how was that process for your group? What did that feel like? So you can kind of just imagine that, since we're running out of time here a little bit. Just want to spend a little bit of time on the idea of inclusivity, and sociocracy is really trying to be equitable. And so we need to think about how can we allow for people to participate in the ways that feel good to them. So some people struggle a lot with verbalizing their feelings. And so sometimes having nonverbal meeting gestures can help to bring that in. Having time to pause for reflection before the comment round can be a really helpful way to bring inclusivity in, because some people have a hard time thinking on the fly. And so like, all right, let's just all take 30 seconds of silence to think about what we want to say in this reaction round. Okay, and then we'll start the round. So that can be really inclusive and helpful. Also, opening with a grounding exercise can be really good to help level everybody's nervous system. So these are just some ways that you can embrace the diversity, the beauty of the diversity of all of our learning and communication styles. I won't super go into these. These are actually gestures from the Occupy movement, and they actually use consensus, but I found these gestures to be really helpful. So like, this is like, wow, I really agree with that. That's awesome. This is like, hey, I know we're doing conversation rounds, but I have some really important information about that, and like, let's talk about it. This one's not on here, but I really like this vibes watch. So you have like 2 V's and you make a W with it, and that's like, wow, there's tension in the room. Facilitator, help! Like, break it up. Let's get back in this shared reality, right? So, and I'll share these slides so you can check these out. But yeah, these can be helpful and just a way to encourage different types of participation. And then really, I want to emphasize feedback here at the end, wanting to do feedback at the end of meetings and performance review feedback for each role and each member, ideally. So we're having a collaborative process about what's going well, what's not going well, and how would we like to improve. You can also do feedback for whole circles. And then you can do like whole organization feedback reviews. So this is, again, how we improve over time, how we iterate, how we evolve. So that's a really big part of sociocracy. Okay, and I'll take a little bit of time for questions, and I also want to have time for a little bit of feedback. So I will stop the screen share here. And yeah, it looks like I have a question. So Emmanuel.
Thank you, Andra. I loved it. So great feedback. Now I want to do the 100-hour thing, the role play thing. But anyway, a question for you and a question for David, probably, as a professor of Indigenous Studies. Is this so different than the council? Like the Indigenous ways to meet and agree and present. It looks, I mean, I don't know, but it just feels so, this is not anything that new. They just formulated in such a way, right? Did you find any reference to indigenous systems of meeting when you were studying?
I did not, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. I'm sure that the influences are present, and yeah, I haven't deeply studied different indigenous styles of governance, but I do think that the council rounds are fairly common in those styles of governance. And yeah, David can speak to that maybe a little better.
I can give you an example. It's not from me, but from uh, uh, a young lawyer who wanted to get agreement from the different elders on certain principles, and so he got them together, and he thought they would just talk for an afternoon, and anyway, it took them 4 days to reach consensus on what these teachings meant. So just as an example, right? So what sociocracy does is it formalizes the process, but indigenous knowledge would be by consensus. So that's, and coming to consensus, that meant going over, iterating and reiterating until they could all agree, which what I gather is the essence of sociocracy anyway.
Yeah, and I think that sociocracy is maybe trying to be a little bit of a balance between those multi-day processes, which I think are really deeply valuable and profound, and the fact that we still right now live in a very, excuse me, productivist capitalist environment. And so like reconciling those two things in this transition ethic moment, I think is important. And I'm not saying, sociocracy is better than consensus models or anything. I don't think that's an important distinction. But what I think is, this is a tool in the toolbox of how to move through things relatively quickly, relatively effectively, and still listening to the voices of everyone in the room. So that's how I would respond to that.
And if I could just interject quickly, another form of governance would be from the council of the elder women, who would consult with the spirit world and come to consensus, or at least agreement. This is what the spirits have said, and then it's up to the men to carry out the decision.
Yeah, real quick before I go back to Michelle, I want to say that in some intentional communities that are doing sociocracy, they'll have an empty chair, and that'll be the seat for the land. And so as you're doing the conversation rounds, you pause when you get to the land, and everyone closes their eyes and just like listens to what the land's questions about the proposal might be, what the land's comments about the proposal might be. And that can be also a really positive way to bring in that more than human world to your meetings. And there's no reason we can't do that. So yeah, Michelle?
Yeah, I was going to actually respond to Emmanuel's question because I am a settler ally, and I'm a member of an Indigenous-led organization, Indigenous Action Canada. And we had a few changes, and there's a smaller membership, so decisions get made way easier. But back when we had several people, what I coming in as a settler person, I thought that these different Indigenous people were agreeing with one another. And then as I got used to the culture, I agreed. I understood that what one person would say is they would restate the parts that they really liked about the person's. Like, this was really good that you did this, and you did this. And then they would go on and say something different. But it wasn't, they weren't pitching them like against each other. And that's maybe why it would take several days, because what would end up happening in our process is people would go through and say several different things, and it kind of would go around and around, and then it might get left, and I think it might get picked up later on. So it was it's a process that it would be very easy for a subtler person who didn't want to be a good ally or thought they were being a good ally to just jump in and push and rush, and that would just kind of spoil it. It was like one of our little process rules were kind of like the indigenous people did their rounds, and then after that they'd invite settler persons to make comment, which helped us to figure out the culture. But they kind of left it to us to figure it out. But it was a really cool thing to watch, and you wouldn't be able to. I don't think you could turn it into a formula. I think it's, you know, you're either raised with it or you watch it long enough that it becomes kind of part of how you breathe.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank
I
you.
do want to acknowledge the comment, the question in the chat about there may be a whole process of discovering and agreeing on shared vision. Is that a necessary assumption? And yes, and we will talk about that in part 2. Kind of how to do like vision, mission, aims, domains, how to get that clear with your organization. So we'll have some space to dig into that more. And yeah, okay. Well, I want to have some time for feedback, but I think that I will go ahead and stop the recording here so you guys can speak freely. And then, yeah, feel free to raise hands. And yeah, how are you feeling leaving this session? And also, do you have any constructive criticism for me, or just yeah, shares, gratitude, anything that wants to come through?